China's on the ascent, Asia's on the ascent. The Atlanticist crowd, the NATO crowd are on the downside of the apex of their power. How that is managed and how that transition is handled is very dangerous. World War III, nuclear weapons, all that jazz. But the global south is rising, BRICS is rising. The 7 billion people in the global south want the lifestyle that the 700 million people in the G7 have, and who are we to stop? Our current mental model is the US is in the middle of a civil war. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Trump is either a fascist dictator, if you believe the people on the left, or the last great hope to restore America to what the founding fathers had envisioned, if you listen to the people on the right. You need not have a strong opinion either way to objectively analyze the situation and say that there is a violent civil war undergoing right now in real time in the U.S.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today is, of course, a returning guest, Doomberg, behind the very popular Doomberg Substack. Doomberg, thanks for carving out the time again today.
Christian, always happy to chat with you, and congrats on all the success. Looking forward to being a contributor to the future of it.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you always making the time to come on. I figured we'd start off with your latest thoughts as it relates to what's going on around the world, geopolitics, markets, et cetera.
Yeah, the big question on the board is the Ukraine situation, which of course is reaching, we think, its inevitable conclusion, a very uncomfortable conclusion for the Western world, for President Trump, for a variety of reasons we could talk about. That war of attrition grinds on. Russia is now on a nightly basis bombarding the Ukraine energy system with hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. How NATO loses that war has always been the big question on the board for the past 2 years for us, long before it was sort of widely accepted that war was lost. And we could talk about what we mean when we say the war is lost. And then, obviously all of this flows into the bifurcation of the world between the BRICS countries, Russia, China, India, Brazil, and the sort of G7 Atlanticist Western-based financial system, and we think gold is screaming a really important historic message in the past month. And so, decades and weeks kind of time period. It's kind of cliche to say that, but I really think it's undeniable that we're entering such a period right now. And so we're thankful that we have, a voice to chronicle all of this, but it really is truly a historic time.
Absolutely. Well, you made reference to the events going on over in Europe, particularly Ukraine, if you care to dive into that with us.
We've got a piece we're working on right now, probably going to publish it this weekend, called Final Countdown. We think NATO losing the war to Russia, which is just undeniably what has transpired and what is transpiring, will likely be the end of the European Union as we know it. The current batch of leaders of the European Union have failed their people, and they have done their level best to play every dirty trick they can to keep the rebellions under wraps. They're spinning a lot of plates. Romania, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, France now with Macron, and Lord knows by the time this publishes what will eventually transpire. But and even though the UK is not in the European Union, obviously Sir Keir Starmer is the least popular prime minister in British history. They're talking about this, digital ID. 3 million people sign a petition and they just ignore it. You can't ignore the people forever. The European Union is ignoring the people, is ignoring the whole concept of sovereign states and cultures. And we don't think it can last. And that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And, it's very sad to see what's going on in Ukraine. We have very strong opinions on how we got here. And many of those opinions are counter to the contemporary narrative that is being fed through the traditional Western propaganda outlets. I think we've talked about this before. To watch 600, 700, 800 drones and dozens of missiles overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense, take out much of its electricity grid just ahead of winter, which we think is a war crime, by the way, to those listening who think we might be Putin apologists. We are realists. You can't defeat Russia on its border in a traditional kinetic war strategy unless you're willing to resort to nuclear weapons, which clearly the West is not. And so watching the last throes of this war after having studied it so carefully for many years is really sad. It's tragic. It's catastrophic. And it's a turning point. NATO has been defeated on the battlefield, and that is going to have reverberations for the next decade or more.
Yeah, I feel like we become so desensitized over time with all these events and things that we hear about in the news that I think oftentimes we fail to recognize that people are literally dying, like a family member. It'd be like a family member dying, as a result of these wars on both sides, and the failure of elites and things that they've done to instigate and prompt that invasion and such. How about any other commentary as it relates to Europe? I know you talked about the EU, Starmer, I think Macron. I don't know any other things that you'd like to cover while we're still in the European.
Sure. Ursula von der Leyen in particular, and the whole Brussels construct, we think is a metastable state that is ripe for collapse. And these types of things happen very suddenly. She's not elected. She's not very bright. And Brussels has been an anchor around the people of Europe. And we're seeing, so what happened in the Czech Republic, right? Former prime minister wins a resounding victory in the elections, despite in the days and weeks ahead of this election, we saw the sort of propaganda of, Russian dirty tricks and Russian interference in the Czech Republic, sort of laying the groundwork to repeat what was done in Romania, where, let's call it what it was, the election was like stolen, totally stolen by those who are sort of pro-EU Brussels crowd. A complete usurpation of democracy. Whenever you hear Ursula von der Leyen say our democracy, you need to emphasize the word our and not the word democracy, because they have very anti-democratic instincts, and they have proven themselves willing and able to interfere in the political scene of sovereign nations. They don't believe in sovereign nations, right? And all the talk about Russian interference. I mean, it's amazing how Putin is omnipotent and impotent all at the same time, right? He is everywhere and always the reason why anything is going wrong, and at the same time a paper tiger that if we just shove a few more billions into Ukraine, we'll topple the whole thing. And so that whole narrative is ripe for collapse. And we think the Macron situation, how that resolves, is a pretty important domino. Friedrich Merz in Germany, wildly unpopular. That coalition looks ripe to fall apart. Sir Keir Starmer, I think you'll see Nigel Farage as the next prime minister of Britain long before the betting markets are calling for it. And Marine Le Pen in France, or her proxy, will win the election once Macron finally submits to reality. We're seeing the last throes of the European Union. Nobody's calling it that right now. We're notoriously early, could be wrong, but in our view, and that's why we're putting it under the masthead in our next piece called Final Countdown, when you just scan the failed project that is the European Union, that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And I think we're on the cusp of some pretty historic things. I mean, the Trump administration walking away from Project Ukraine financially creates an impossible burden for the European Union. I mean, Ukraine is a $50 to $60 billion a year commitment, and the European Union just can't afford that. And they would be wise to stop pretending like they can, so that what is left can be salvaged. Right? Losing wars is hard, and that's why you should work very hard to never get in them, which is something we've been saying for a very long time. It gives us no pleasure to say these things. This is a catastrophe. And a catastrophe for the people of Ukraine first and foremost. That country has been destroyed. And the full accountability of how this happened, it's easy to say everything is Putin's fault, which is what the propaganda will saturate the airwaves with once the reality of what has transpired dawns on people. But let's look and see what history says in 20 years.
Absolutely. How about as it relates to the Middle East? Obviously, today's October 7th, so the 2-year anniversary of the event that happened. I'm intrigued to hear your kind of thoughts as the genesis of that has kind of unfolded, people's take on it, and how that's impacted things.
One of the great mysteries of our time is the relationship between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump. And Trump says multiple, one of the things about observing Donald Trump is you can't take everything he says literally, especially everything he posts to social media. On the one hand, you have Trump pushing this peace plan, which we would be all for. Not getting into the details, but peace is kind of what we're all for. At the same time, I see a video circulating on Twitter today of Benjamin Netanyahu warning about Iranian missile developments and how the need to strike Iran has never been higher. So the classic "let's go to war" approach, which seems incongruent with what Trump is trying to do. I take it at face value that Trump sincerely would like to get the hostages freed and to end the suffering of the people of Gaza. It's the type of subject that you can't comment or write upon without inflaming both sides. So we tend to just sort of observe and try to understand what it means for energy more than anything else, because that's just what we do. But our view, of course, is controversial, which is that Israel's not in a position to go back to war with Iran, and we don't know what Netanyahu's talking about. There's a mutually assured destruction situation, and Israel's on the cusp of being in a very bad place. It's like its economy is extraordinarily challenged right now. It's a very small country, and the depletion of U.S. anti-missile armaments is real. And so if Iran and Israel heats up again, it'd be quite challenging for Israel. And sure, they allegedly have nuclear bombs, and they might nuke Iran. That's who's winning in that scenario. Again, I think Trump, if he were left to his own devices and didn't have this sort of warmongering, uni-party, neocon wing of Washington, which we think is 80% of Congress, by the way, it's not a Democrat or a Republican thing, he would genuinely like to create peace, cut a deal with Putin and China, and then take care of the Western Hemisphere and embark upon the reinvigoration of U.S. manufacturing that he ran on. But he seems to be captured by the power brokers of Washington, who never saw a war they didn't like, and always overestimate the U.S.'s ability to win them. And when the quagmire inevitably overwhelms the situation, they just move on to the next war. It's one of the great mysteries of our time, why the Uniparty in Washington keeps repeating all the same mistakes. If I live in flyover country in the U.S., if you can ask 10,000 people about whether they care who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass. You'd be lucky to find one who even knows where it is. I mean, and yet billions and billions, hundreds of billions have been spent on this adventure, and it's truly remarkable. I know you've given similar time and thought to this situation, but it's a real mystery to me.
I completely agree with you, and I think just as we mentioned offline, time and time again throughout past epochs, it's the same thing: failure of elites to figure out iron out their challenges, and you've got the average lay person, so to speak, thrown into the meat grinder, and all the economic fallout that results from that. As it relates to as it relates to Trump and such, and then Venezuela is another thing I'd like to get your thoughts on. As far as the U.S. getting more involved in that, I don't know if you have any thoughts that you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this one's pretty easy to predict. We wrote a piece on the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated, on January 20th, called "Misreading the Room," where we warned that Maduro, the president of Venezuela, ought to be careful. If history is any guide, when the super major oil companies assemble near your border and you have enormous oil and gas resources that are currently underdeveloped, the track record of dictator strongmen in such scenarios is just not a glorious one. That doesn't mean it's legal. It doesn't mean we approve it, but it's just going to happen. And so, yeah, the armada that is being assembled around Venezuela is not just going to turn around and go home. Venezuela is home to the world's largest hydrocarbon resource. It used to produce 4 million barrels a day of oil. It now produces 1. Guyana next door is the most exciting oil development project in the world, from 0 to 1 million barrels a day or wherever they are. Exxon's there, Chevron's there now through the Hess acquisition. The Chinese are there. The Malaysians are there. And Venezuela, of course, claims that as part of their territory, which is another sort of friction point. And you have Chevron's, century-long history in Venezuela, not plural, singular. And you have this Saudi Arabia sitting there underdeveloped, and you have Maduro on the critical path of it. And he's, if history is any guide, not long for this world. And the U.S. will get entangled in another military adventure, more likely to defeat Venezuela than Russia, to be fair, especially since U.S. supply chains are much closer than far away Ukraine. Doesn't mean we condone it, but it's predictable. And generally speaking, when you have a critical mass of military assets assembled right next door to a bunch of super major oil companies, order usually follows.
Well, you're reminding me of the like Banana Wars and Smedley Butler's era.
Great piece in the Monetary Skeptic. Our friend Pablo Hill wrote about this exact Banana War as the opening story to his framing, which we think is 100% right, and we emphasized today in our piece about Mexico, which I happen to talk about as well. He emphasized that the war against cartels is really a war for control over energy, because the cartels in the past decade have become so intertwined with the energy industries of Latin and South America, Central and South America, that they're indistinguishable at this point. And we put a piece out this morning about Mexico just to frame for people just how saturated the drug cartels are in the oil and gas markets and the refining markets in Mexico, with penetration into the U.S. as well.
Well, you beat me to it, because that was going to be my next question to you, was pertaining to the article that you just released. If you'd like to dive into that with us.
It's really shocking. The Mexican National Oil Company has utterly been destroyed, is too strong a word, but when a cancer gets too aggressive and destroys its host, nobody wins. Yeah? And crude oil is stolen from Pemex on a massive scale. It's then smuggled into the U.S., where all manner of shell companies and gang-controlled entities launder it into the U.S. refineries, and then diesel and gasoline are brought back into Mexico and disguised as lubricants, so they don't have to pay taxes, and then it feeds this enormous, black market of gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and other things in Mexico. And at every step of the way, the narco cartels are catching a vig. I mean, they're like in the meantime, Pemex has $100 billion in debt and $20 billion in accounts payable, and it's choking the Mexican fiscal situation. And so you have new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, issuing sophisticated PCAP paper to bail out Pemex, but in reality, she's kind of bailing out the cartels, because Pemex is the mother's milk of their revenue generation. An explosive story in the Financial Times that we quoted as the opening of that piece. They make almost as much money stealing energy as they do selling drugs.
Well, I guess since you brought up the president of Mexico, how much would you say they are in cahoots with cartels?
This is the big question when you read the piece. And by the way, how much of the U.S. government is? I mean, let's not assume that we have the cleanest shirt on the clothesline. The former president, AMLO, whose name, full name escapes me, but it seems like very close associates of his have been arrested, and she's walking a very fine line. There comes a point where, this is happening on such a scale that a fusion between the cartels and the quote unquote legitimate government is kind of undeniable. And what that really means is disturbing. One of the comments to our piece was from a good friend of ours who literally his only comment was Bush. And the implication was that powerful families in the U.S. are involved in this as well. And if the full sort of nature of what was going on was exposed to people, it'd be shocking. I think the piece actually shocked a lot of people. If you read the comments to the piece, which only paid subscribers can, people were blown away, like they had no idea this was going on or was at this scale. And like an oil tanker picks up diesel in the U.S. Gulf Coast, pulls into a port in Mexico, and not one capable of the traditional unloading and storage of fuel. They pull up into a port that barely looks like a port, and there's hundreds of trucks, and that these trucks just tap right into the tanker itself and take this black market diesel and go sell it because it's discounted because no taxes were paid as it was brought into the country. And like satellites can see what's going on. The governments must know what's going on. And so there comes a point where like this is a charade. Like, is Mexico a sovereign, or is it, as Trump describes Venezuela, a cartel in charge of a petrostate? And I think there's an enormous amount of this going on around the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And we note with interest that Rubio visited Mexico, and then suddenly 14 people got arrested, and some of them very high profile, some of them connected to very high profile people. But is that just for show? Is this really going to get cleaned up? And can the government actually do it? Like, is Mexico a failed state? Is the U.S. a failed state? How much was the Biden family doing? How much was the Bush family doing? How much are the Clintons involved? Who knows? I mean, obviously, we have no evidence for any of those names. I'm just putting it out there that if it suddenly was revealed that members of Congress were lining their pockets in similar ways, would you be shocked? I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. I hope it's not happening. I don't think it's happening, and I'm certainly not claiming that it's happening. But boy, it's really hard not to be cynical after you research and write stories like this.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, as I've gone down this rabbit hole, Doomberg, and the other guests that I've had on, I'm just blown away by how not that I by any means have grasped the full picture, but at least to have some glimpse into it, it is amazing the level of corruption, of the myriad of things that go on behind the scenes, from laundering to the connections and ties. You mentioned various political dynasties, families. I think it would really disturb a lot of people.
Yeah, and it can't get too cynical because then it's sort of hard to hard to go from day to day. And you also don't want to like fall into even though I hate the phrase, like conspiratorial rabbit holes. You need some tether to reality as well. And I don't want to live in a world where such is the reality. Critics would say that's being naive, but you start with family, start with your business, start with your partners, and go from there and hope to try to fix it from the bottom up. And we're seeing a lot of that. I think not to get too far down a side track, but the whole response to the Charlie Kirk assassination, which was gruesome. I'm seeing a lot of sort of Christian influence coming back online, social media, young influencers. That gives me some hope. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I understand the value of faith. And so it's a dangerous time. There are parts of the reaction to the Charlie Kirk assassination that disturb me greatly, especially the people that were celebrating it. I just can't understand that. But nonetheless, the U.S. is very polarized, and we'll see how it goes.
Absolutely. Well, as it relates to the polarization going on, I'd love to segue kind of to your thoughts more on Trump's recent, rhetoric and his administration. Some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing, troops, of course, National Guard and such being deployed and things of that nature. If you could kind of unpack your current thoughts on that.
Yeah, our mental model, which is how we like to describe sort of how we are viewing things. We develop mental models with certain axioms, and then we observe the data and see whether they need be altered in any way. Our current mental model is the U.S. is in the middle of a civil war. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Trump is either a fascist dictator, if you believe the people on the left, or the last great hope to restore America to what the founding fathers had envisioned. If you listen to the people on the right, you need not have a strong opinion either way to objectively analyze the situation and say that there is a violent civil war undergoing right now in real time in the U.S. It's how we think. in the same way that we think World War III started in 2014, and that the Battle of Ukraine is just one of the skirmishes in a broader world war. The U.S. is in a civil war right now, and it remains to be seen which side will be victorious. You have a huge push from the right on immigration, and a huge obstructive sort of covering fire from mostly liberal judges, real separation of powers questions, real fundamental issues with the Constitution. And I do think the assassination of Charlie Kirk was a potential turning point in that war. But we're in a civil war in the U.S. I live in the U.S., so I say we. The United States is in the middle of a civil war. It is simmering / hot, not quite full blown, but it's there. Cultural, political, media, and police. You're watching. This is really remarkable. So you have like ICE agents in Portland and the police there not helping them out, or maybe it was Chicago. Who knows? It's hard to keep track of everything, but do we have constitutional order or do we not? Now, look, I would say this: Trump has flouted the Constitution in significant ways. But at the same time, like if you came to the country illegally, maybe you ought to have to fess up to that and to make that right, either by leaving and coming back legally or leaving and not coming back. There's a legal way to immigrate to the United States. And the Biden administration, I think, did a huge disservice to the country in this regard. And so we'll see. Trump is a polarizing figure. He makes us cringe a lot. But at the same time, he has very good instincts. And so, yeah, it's civil war. And in any war, emotions are very elevated, very high. And I'm sure there'll be people listening to this that think we're not anti-Trump enough, and people who think that we're nowhere near pro-Trump enough. And we're not just trying to play it down the middle out of some cowardly desire to stay out of the fray. It's challenging, and the 40 years of military-industrial abuse of the American taxpayer is kind of what got us here. I understand that the income inequality in the U.S. and how it has exploded is creating a lot of disenfranchised people, and getting caught up in sort of counter-revolutionary type movements and thinking is as old as time. And the power brokers, represented currently by Trump because he's in power, and their desire to crack down on it is also understandable and consistent with history. And so the only thing I would say as sort of a cautionary tale, something we've been thinking about a lot internally, is when a country starts arresting former presidents, it's very hard to stop. Can't really find all that many in history where you just arrest one, okay? And the U.S. started arresting former presidents in 2023. I mean, it just did when the Biden administration and its proxy allies arrested Trump, charged him with multiple felonies, convicted him of multiple felonies. And Trump regained power. And is it surprising to us that we're arresting the former head of the FBI? And we suspect President Obama might be arrested. And on the MAGA right, they would say this is all totally justified. And what happened to Trump and to J6 and all that other stuff, we've read both sides and we understand it. But taking a step back objectively, once you start arresting former presidents, it's really hard to stop. And the very quick, logical, predictable conclusion is the current party in power is never going to leave because they're going to get arrested if they leave. And so that very quickly ends up in sort of dictatorships of a variety, mild or maximum. But it was a seminal moment to see the Trump mugshot in 2023. Look, Nixon got pardoned. Trump refused to prosecute Hillary. There's a reason. Once you cross that chasm, very hard to undo it. You've sort of opened Pandora's box. And Trump is anything if not super talented at resisting revenge, right? I mean, if we're being honest. And so it's a dangerous time. whatever your views are of what happened to Trump or what he's doing now, that's not really relevant to our analysis. We're at a phase where the U.S. has started arresting former presidents, and we think that's meaningful.
Well, this has me thinking of the segue of I know everyone mentions Rome, so cliche, from a republic to an empire, and not that I'm like some expert on that period, but I'm thinking of like Caesar, and but instead of people assassinating and killing people today, it's arresting or using lawfare or using other instruments, and how it's just changed to the times. But I'm thinking of that as you're mentioning about kind of civil unrest and dictatorships. And
Let me add something of interest, because it's I peruse Twitter. Twitter's still an interesting source of information. We don't participate on Twitter, but directly, it's sort of inbound only. Saw a fascinating tweet. Every once in a while you see a fascinating tweet. Side note, one of them was, in 300 years, Trump will be considered a mythical figure that didn't actually exist, which was kind of just made me laugh, just given the size of his personality. But the tweet that your comment about Rome reminded me of was actually pretty profound, as gold is crossing 4,000 an ounce today, as you and I are talking, right? The price of gold doubling in the reserve currency, as measured by the reserve currency, global reserve currency, US dollars, in 18 months is rather unsettling. And historically, whenever you see basically the debasement of a global reserve currency of this scale on this time frame, broadly what comes next is not very pleasant. And so that gave me pause. It is one of those tweets where like, that's pretty insightful. Like I've said multiple times, like gold going up too quickly always unsettles me. I have far more assets denominated in US dollars than I do in ounces of gold. And what it says about those US dollars is pretty scary and potentially quite meaningful. The US currently is the global reserve currency, and the gold market is signaling its collapse. There's no other way to say it. It
okay, so
takes
oh, sorry,
no, go ahead. No, it takes 4,000 US dollars to buy an ounce now, and it used to take 30.
So in light of what's going on, of course, sociopolitically, economically, do you see any way in which we can prevent what seems to be on the horizon? Is there any way to steer this? I mean, et cetera.
Sure, there's always a way. I mean, look, Japan got nuked twice in 1945 and then became, a dominant manufacturing powerhouse 4 decades later. Germany was totally destroyed in World War II and then became the third largest economy in the world and one of the most sophisticated manufacturing economies on Earth before it impaled itself on energy. So we're nowhere near those depths of crisis. It's a crisis. Look, hyperinflation came and went, a very short period of time. In Weimar, a lot of people got destroyed, but they came out of it. We'll see. Much depends on President Trump and Congress, and but it is a very disconcerting time, kind of fourth turning. Neil Howe, fourth turning type time frame, a couple of years away from when that book would have predicted that we'd be seeing this kind of this kind of disruption and chaos. But beyond that, of course, there's always hope and the light. And I listened to Simon Mikhailovich on a Grant Williams podcast a couple of years ago talking about his grandmother in Russia and just what she had survived. World War I, Great Depression, World War II, communist Russia, and yet the family nucleus sort of was maintained, and there they are. I don't want to be too doomy, despite the masthead name, but we're heading into pretty challenging times. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I thought I'd ask your take on Asia in light of time, as well as any other things that you feel are not receiving enough attention today.
Yeah, I think the West is deluding itself about its relative power position compared to China. I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting and the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the parade tied with it was a turning point. Back to the whole BRICS versus the G7, the C in BRICS is China, and it's very powerful. We've written a lot about China, about semiconductors, about how we're underestimating, we, the West, are underestimating China's technological power, its military power, its manufacturing power. This comes down to how GDP is measured. If you measure it in US dollars, it tells you a whole different story than if you measure it in purchasing power parity, which we believe is the correct way to measure it. China's on the ascent, Asia's on the ascent. The Atlanticist crowd, the NATO crowd are on the downside of the apex of their power. How that is managed and how that transition is handled is very dangerous. World War III, nuclear weapons, all that jazz. But the global South is rising. BRICS is rising. The 7 billion people in the global South want the lifestyle that the 700 million people in the G7 have, and who are we to stop them? So, there's lots of ways you can go, and we don't have time to go through it, but it's the end of climate change. It's the end of all of these luxuries of the West. And hopefully it's the end of world wars, but we shall see. We're in a truly historic period that historians will be writing about for decades. And let's hope that the powers that be have the wisdom to navigate the world to a place where more people have a better chance at achieving economic sustainability, and we don't slip down one of the nuclear rabbit holes and end the whole thing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Doomberg, how can people learn more about you and get in touch with you?
Yeah, two projects I want to pitch today. Obviously, Doomberg, which is our main masthead, doomberg.com, but also we launched something new and completely different on September 1st called Classics Read Aloud, as the name would imply. The century plus old classic writings presented in very high quality to Doomberg standard. The motto of classicsreadaloud.substack.com is you're never too young or too old to enjoy being read to. Escape to the comfort of your own private garden and hear some of the sort of best works of writing, narrated in beautiful style, and a true escape from sort of the noise and all of the nasty stuff you and I have been talking about today. And we launched it on September 1st. A Doomberg co-founder and the editor-in-chief of the Doomberg newsletter is the voice of it and the real thrust behind it. It's gotten really great product market fit, over 2,000 subscribers already. So check out classicsreadaloud.com if you're interested in a change of pace, and then you can find all of Doomberg's work at doomberg.com as well. And Christian, always a pleasure to talk with you. Always look forward to coming on. Happy to see the email invite when it hits our inbox. And next time we come back together, let's hope World War III hasn't escalated.
Amen. Amen. Hey, thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to getting the latest update from you next month. Quick ask, over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.